What was daily life really like for young girls trapped in slavery in ancient Rome? The truth is more terrifying than most history books will ever tell you. They were children stolen from their homes, sold at markets like animals, and forced into lives of unthinkable pain. Their childhoods ended the moment Roman soldiers or traders laid hands on them. Most never saw freedom again. Rome is often remembered for its emperors, gladiators, and grand monuments. But behind the marble columns and military triumphs was a hidden world of suffering that powered the entire empire. Historians estimate that at Rome's peak, between 25 to 40% of the population were slaves. That's millions of human beings treated as property. Among them were countless young girls, taken at their most vulnerable age and forced into roles that destroyed their bodies and their minds. Today, we're going to step inside their world. We'll follow their lives from the moment of capture to the daily horrors they endured, from backbreaking labor to the most horrifying abuses, and see why their stories still echo through history as some of humanity's darkest chapters. When we talk about Roman slavery, most people think of men chained in mines or gladiators fighting to the death in the Colosseum. But the truth is, young girls often faced an even darker fate. They were seen as property, not people. Their childhood was stolen before it could begin. Their futures were decided by strangers who saw them as objects to be used and discarded. These were not isolated cases or rare tragedies. Rome's entire economy and way of life depended on enslaved people. The grand villas, the elaborate feasts, the public baths, the temples, all of it was built and maintained by slave labor. And when those enslaved were children, especially young girls, the results were devastating in ways that modern minds can barely comprehend. Roman law didn't just allow this system, it protected and encouraged it. Slaves had no legal rights, no protection from abuse, no voice in their own fate. For young girls, this legal powerlessness created a nightmare where their suffering was not just tolerated, but institutionalized. They existed in a world where their pain was invisible, their cries unheard, and their humanity denied. Most young girls didn't start their lives in Rome. They were violently torn from everything they knew. Roman armies swept across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East like tsunamis of destruction, capturing people as spoils of war. Military commanders considered human captives as valuable as gold or silver, sometimes more so. Imagine being just 8 or 9 years old in a small Gallic village when Roman legions appear on the horizon. The soldiers pour through your streets like a flood. You watch in terror as they drag your parents away in chains while you're thrown into a cart with dozens of other screaming children, never to see your home again. The journey to Rome could take months, with children packed like cargo in ships or forced to march hundreds of miles on foot. But war wasn't the only source. Desperate families, crushed by debt or famine, sometimes sold their own children to slave traders. Pirates prowled the Mediterranean, raiding coastal villages specifically to capture young people for Rome's insatiable slave markets. Professional kidnappers operated networks that stretched across the known world, targeting children because they were easier to control and could be trained for specific purposes. The trade routes that brought exotic goods to Rome, silk from China, spices from India, amber from the Baltic, also carried a more horrific cargo: human beings. Young girls might be captured in Britain, sold in Gaul, shipped through Alexandria, and end up in a Roman household, having lost everything that made them who they were. Once captured, these girls were brought to the slave markets, and this is where their humanity was officially erased. In Rome, the largest market was held in the Campus Martius, a vast open area where thousands of people were displayed like livestock. The scene was a nightmare of human suffering played out as routine commerce. Buyers walked past rows of chained children as casually as they might browse vegetables in a market. Traders employed cruel techniques to make their merchandise more appealing. Sometimes they used makeup to hide bruises or signs of illness. They were forced to stand naked, so every part of their body could be inspected by potential buyers who treated them like animals being evaluated for purchase. Each girl carried a wooden tag around her neck called a titulus, listing her qualities: age, skills, place of origin, languages spoken, and even whether she was a virgin. Auctioneers would force children to perform tasks to demonstrate their abilities, lifting weights to show strength, reciting words to prove they could speak Latin, or even dancing to display grace. Buyers could examine them intimately, checking for diseases, scars, or signs of previous abuse. The children had no choice but to submit to this degradation, knowing their lives depended on someone deciding they were worth purchasing. For many girls, their fate was to work in wealthy Roman households. But don't think of this as domestic service, as we might understand it today. These children became human machines, worked to the point of exhaustion and beyond. A typical day began before sunrise. Often around 4 a.m. girls were responsible for lighting fires throughout the house, a dangerous task that often resulted in burns. They had to fetch water from public fountains that might be miles away, carrying heavy jugs that could weigh 40 pounds when full. They scrubbed floors on their hands and knees until their skin was raw, and washed clothes in cold water that turned their hands numb. The physical demands were crushing for small bodies. Girls might spend 16 to 18 hours a day on their feet, moving constantly between tasks. They carried heavy loads up and down stairs, cleaned waste from latrines, and tended fires that filled their lungs with smoke. They slept on the floor in kitchens or storerooms, often sharing space with rats and insects. Unlike free Roman children who learned to read, played games, and had time for rest, enslaved girls were treated as machines that needed only enough food and sleep to keep functioning. Their childhood was stolen day by day, replaced by endless labor that broke their bodies before they reached adulthood. Perhaps the darkest aspect of their reality was systematic sexual abuse. Many young girls were bought specifically for this purpose, their youth and vulnerability seen as desirable qualities by buyers who had no regard for their humanity. Roman law considered slaves property in every sense, which meant masters could use them however they wished without legal consequences. Some girls were forced into prostitution in brothels called lupanars, dark, cramped buildings where they might service dozens of men a day. These establishments were often located in the worst parts of the city, filled with disease and violence. Others were kept as personal concubines, suffering abuse in the supposed safety of private homes. Even girls, as young as 12 or 13, could be forced into sexual relationships with masters or their sons. The psychological trauma was compounded by the fact that resistance was not just futile, but dangerous. Fighting back could result in severe punishment or death. Some girls were used as entertainment at private parties. where wealthy Romans would abuse them as part of their evening's pleasure. The poet Martial wrote casually about such practices, treating the suffering of enslaved children as a source of amusement. This wasn't hidden or shameful behavior. It was openly discussed and legally protected. The trauma extended beyond the immediate abuse. Girls who became pregnant had no control over their fate or their children's. Babies born to slaves were automatically enslaved themselves, meaning these young mothers watched their own children enter the same nightmare they were trapped in. To maintain control over millions of enslaved people, the Romans developed sophisticated systems of terror that were particularly cruel when applied to children. Punishments weren't just about correcting behavior. They were designed to break spirits and eliminate any thought of resistance. Whippings were routine for minor infractions. Girls might be beaten for dropping a dish, speaking without permission, or simply moving too slowly. The whips used were often embedded with metal or bone fragments that tore flesh and left permanent scars. These scars served as visual reminders of the consequences of disobedience. For more serious offenses, punishments became horrifyingly creative. Branding with hot irons marked a girl forever as a slave and a troublemaker. Runaways who were recaptured might have their feet cut off or be crucified as a warning to others. Some masters used psychological torture, forcing girls to watch other slaves being punished as a way of maintaining fear. The damage inflicted on these young girls went far beyond physical abuse. Slavery was designed to destroy identity, hope, and the very sense of self. Many girls lost all memory of who they had been before capture. Their original names were taken away and replaced with Roman ones that reflected their status or place of origin. Britannica for a girl from Britain, Syra for one from Syria. Their native languages were literally beaten out of them. Speaking in their mother tongue could result in severe punishment, so girls learned to suppress not just their words, but their thoughts. Over time, they began to forget the sounds of their childhood, the songs their mothers sang, the stories their grandparents told. The constant terror created what we might now recognize as complex trauma. Girls developed hypervigilance, always watching for signs of their master's mood. They learned to make themselves invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to suppress any sign of personality or individual will. The most terrifying truth about the lives of young female slaves in ancient Rome is this: there was almost no escape from this nightmare. While Roman law theoretically allowed slaves to purchase their freedom or be freed by their masters, young girls rarely had access to either path. Manumission, the legal process of freeing a slave, usually required years of faithful service and often a significant payment. But girls were typically worked so hard and given so little that accumulating money was nearly impossible. Even if they managed to save small amounts, masters could confiscate their possessions at any time. Hear the most shocking part that historians rarely discuss openly. The average lifespan of a young female slave was tragically short, often only reaching into their 20s or early 30s. The reasons were numerous and horrifying. Many died from overwork and exhaustion, their small bodies unable to handle the constant physical demands. Others succumbed to diseases that spread rapidly through cramped, unsanitary living conditions. A significant number died from injuries sustained during beatings and other forms of abuse. What makes this even more disturbing is that this high mortality rate was often calculated. Some masters found it more economical to work slaves to death and replace them than to provide adequate care. Human beings were treated with less consideration than livestock because they represented a smaller financial investment. When young female slaves died, their bodies were typically thrown into mass graves outside city walls. There were no funeral rites, no mourning, and no acknowledgement of their humanity even in death. Archaeological evidence from these burial sites reveals thousands of young skeletons bearing signs of malnutrition, disease, and physical trauma. The world of young female slaves in ancient Rome was one of systematic dehumanization, where children were transformed into property, and their suffering was legally protected and socially accepted. They were captives in every sense, captured from their homes, trapped in households, broken in body and spirit by a system that treated them as less than human. When we admire Rome's architectural marvels or celebrate its contributions to law and culture, we must remember who paid the price. Behind every grand temple, every elaborate feast, every piece of art that has survived to inspire us today, children were living in chains, their lives sacrificed to build an empire that has become synonymous with civilization and progress. Their silence in the historical record speaks louder than any emperor's proclamation. These girls, whose names we will never know, whose faces we will never see, whose voices were silenced before they could cry out, represent one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. Their stories remind us that progress built on the suffering of the innocent is no progress at all, and that true civilization can only be measured by how it treats its most vulnerable members. If you want to uncover more of history's fascinating and often chilling stories, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a chance to explore the past with us.